We're the ones interpreting the value. We, in the processes that we impose on this, are the ones that will ultimately define the value of what the Internet of Things is for today and moving forward. So at Harbor, we think of these interactions between sensors, between connectivity, between people and processes, the interactions between these entities that are creating new smart systems, smart services, and applications. Now, the examples on the screen here are all products that are already well underway on the market, connected products, that is. And these are nothing special per se, but the point to take away here is that simply by adding data to these original products, analog products, we're infusing them, or imbuing them with new functions and new features. At Harbor, we call this smart systems. And we say systems because this fundamentally requires multiple different types of businesses, types of companies, multiple entities within an ecosystem. I mentioned we look at both industrial and consumer-side IoT. This is our 2016 venue map segmentation. And although this is a bit of a complex slide, the point here is simple. There's no sector that is immune to the impacts of the Internet of Things. Every vertical has its own set of challenges and what different constructs for what defines value. So zooming in a little bit to more of the consumer side, you all might have heard some of the bold predictions from many research firms, technology companies, Gartner, MIT, Cisco, McKinsey, 50 billion devices within the next 4 years. Harbor, we predict conservatively this will hit about 36.4 billion devices within the next 4 years. But where is this coming from? Well, for one thing, this is already well underway. Those mobile devices sitting in your pockets have between 7 and 14 sensors already in each of them. Our digital TVs, our set-top boxes, suddenly through this proliferation of connected devices, of robotics, of beacons, of digital signage, of connected appliances, cars, all sorts of different things, this proliferation, this digitization of every realm of our lives, from our bodies to our homes, to our store environments, private and public transportation, public environments, indeed nature itself, parks, street crossings, etc., fundamentally changes the way that consumers think about what it is to interact with the Internet and what it is to consume the Internet. So I want to talk through this framework that I developed in some research I published on this space that really looks at sort of the evolutionary trajectory of brand and consumer interaction. It used to be that when a brand had something to say, a message, they would broadcast it outwards. And consumers didn't really have the opportunity to respond or to make known the way that they felt about that message or that service. This was a traditional broadcast model. Think radio, think billboards. With the advent of the internet and social media, this fundamentally changed because once brands started using these channels, or even in analog channels, consumers could communicate directly back to the brand in near real time or real time. They could also communicate with other consumers about that brand interaction. This has completely changed the way that brands interact with their end customers through digital channels, social media, Twitter customer service, blogs, online communities, things of that nature. Now enter the Internet of Things. When objects have a voice, suddenly brands can not only communicate with consumers and consumers back to brands, but they can communicate with objects. Manufacturers can communicate with those objects. Objects can communicate back to consumers. Objects can communicate to other objects. And so what this enables from a brand customer experience standpoint is this multi-way communications mode, where suddenly all of these different entities can be speaking to each other. And not only is this collected in real time, but through things like machine learning and predictive analytics, predictively, preemptively. So let's look at what do we mean when we're talking about 5 use cases on consumer-side IoT. This is the flagship graphic from research I published on this space, and what you might notice initially is that there's not too much mention of technology. As we just talked about, there are a lot of different technologies that comprise the Internet of Things. Beacons, robots, wearables, smartphones, all of these different things are now being imbued with sensors. And so I think it's important that we look at and that we advise brands on a way to take an approach that is not centric to one specific technology. So reward is the first use case that we see in customer-facing Internet of Things. And this is kind of an extension of reward as we think about and know of it today, extension of coupons and promotion. The example on the screen is a well-timed advertisement. Say if I just received my best time on a jog, I'm sent an advertisement for 50% off of shoes, for example. Relatively low-hanging fruit or an easy opportunity for most brands. Gamification is another sub-use case that we see, and one that I've seen already here at the conference, which makes me excited. A lot of interesting things happening here in terms of augmented reality. The example on the screen comes from Walgreens, which is an American pharmacy company, which is actually using augmented reality apps to navigate their consumers through the store. This is tied directly with the loyalty program, such that if they take certain routes through the store, they can collect points, they can collect badges. It sort of gamifies the entire experience. The next sub-use case that we see is really around entertainment. And this is the idea of, I like to say fun. This could be access to exclusive content, to celebrities, musical content. It could also be something like what Lego is doing, where they're allowing kids to view through augmented reality new formations of their Legos. It could also be something aesthetic, where say if I'm at a theme park or walking by a digital sign or exhibit, suddenly music happens or some interesting lighting display happens. Again, the idea here is not necessarily direct ROI or return on investment per se. It's more of an interesting brand experience. It's more brand awareness, brand building. The next use case that we see is around information decision making. And this is the idea of empowering consumers with the ability to access and act on intelligence. From a marketing standpoint, I like to think of this as right content, right place, right person, right platform, etc. Evaluation is a simple use case here. This is the idea of using primarily content, digital content, to help customers make a decision. Hopefully in real time. Hopefully, say if I'm standing in front of a connected dishwasher, serving me up a content based on beacon or GPS information, saying here's a comparison guide between this and the other one, or perhaps this is information based on ratings and reviews from others like myself. Navigation is another sub-use case, and this is very similar to what we see on the industrial side, basically asset tracking, but except for objects or products. So perhaps I can track a parcel that I've sent in the mail. Perhaps I can track, as the example on the screen, this is Berlin's Smart City Parking app, which allows me as a driver to find the nearest parking space. This creates efficiency in that process. Monitoring is another sub-use case, whereby information directly made available from the sensors connected to an object allow us to track, say, our steps, or our sleeping patterns, or how much windshield wiper fluid is in our cars, or whether grandma took her medicine or not. Again, similar to on the industrial side, except not so much wind turbines or medical devices, but more things that matter to consumers. News is another interesting sub-use case, and this actually is, this was a surprise in the research. One of the best examples I can give of this, I mentioned I live in San Francisco, and we had an earthquake out there about a year ago, and Jawbone, the connected fitness tracker wearable company, actually released a piece of content that aggregated, important from a privacy standpoint, all of the data from sleepers relative to the epicenter of the earthquake. Again, not so much ROI, they're not going to go get a bunch of purchases necessarily from this, but it's adding empirical evidence through their brand voice based on sensor data, based on their product. An example I had to share, I love this one, I'm kind of an augmented reality nerd. You guys might have heard of this. IKEA is taking the in-store experience in the home. There's a lot of companies trying to do the opposite, but I like this example because they're solving a real problem. The problem of what would that sofa actually look like in my house? And so using this app, you can pan through your house, you can actually superimpose the couch or the sofa, you can change the color, you can change the print, you can change the size, and indeed you can purchase it directly from the app. Speaking of purchase, facilitation is the next broad use case that we see in consumer-side IoT, and this is really around facilitating the very use of the product, both the action or interaction with the product as well as the transaction. And so payment is the first example that we see. There's a lot going on in the mobile payment space using things like NFC, for example, Bluetooth, for example, Apple Pay, Google Pay. Again, these are using sensors to enable, to facilitate the payment process. Identity is another sub-use case that we see, and this is really critical to building that personalized, customized, or individually crafted experience that we expect when we're talking about using data to inform brand-consumer interactions. This is not only important from a privacy standpoint, which is critical, we'll talk about that in a second, but also from the standpoint of, again, that unique experience. I'm going to, say, in my connected car or in my in-home entertainment system, expect a very different experience than, say, my child would, or my husband or wife, or my grandparent. Conversion is another example that we see, which is interesting. So from a marketing standpoint, conversion is understanding a behavior, understanding customer behavior in order to inform an action. So if I go online and I download content, for example, a bunch of pieces of, say, a white paper, a brand might think that I'm interested in that product. But when we bring these digital tracking techniques into the physical world, let's say I walk by that dishwasher 4 or 5 times within 10 minutes, that's meaningful to a brand. That's meaningful to a company who's trying to sell me that product. So conversion in this context takes on a much wider meaning than just content. Again, enabled by sensors. Finally, utility in the facilitation use case is really a broad category. And this is the idea of basically everything that we see from a connected product standpoint, facilitating the very use of the product. So your connected ovens, your connected coffee makers, your connected dog food dispensers, your connected, on the example here is of a garage door opener or closer. And again, this is about facilitating the use of the product, typically through remote management, perhaps through gesture, perhaps through preemptive capabilities or functionalities. It's using the sensors to make the very use of the product easier and more convenient. An example, you all may have heard of this. I was looking through some German examples. The Rumo as Bag to Go offers owners sort of a preemptive check-in, which saves paper, I think is great, and allows you to check in before actually arriving. This is also a good example of the monitoring use case. And I think what's really interesting about this is it actually allows people to see when their bag has been opened. By the way, I don't own one of these, but if any of you do, please come talk to me afterwards. I'm very curious your experience with it. The next use case that we see is around service. And again, this is an extension of what we see on the industrial side, both from a reactive standpoint as well as a proactive standpoint. What does that mean? Well, reactive service is basically the model that we've always had. An issue occurs, a company responds. And the Internet of Things is effective from this standpoint as well. The example on the screen comes from Whirlpool connected laundry machine, which serves up consumers a diagnostic tool as well as content and troubleshooting guides if they encounter an issue. Again, it's reacting a little bit more efficiently than having to get on the customer service line, call the maintenance guy to come out there. It may still be required, but again, it's a step in the right direction in terms of making that service experience a little bit easier. Now, proactive service gets much more interesting, and this is the idea of using sensor data to predict or to identify an issue before a customer even realizes that they have a problem. One of my favorite examples of this is Tesla, the connected car company. I think about 1.5 years ago, they had a recall of about 29,000 cars. Well, because Tesla is basically software on wheels, and it truly exists in the software-hardware paradigm, they were able to message their drivers directly through the car that the car had been recalled, but that they would be able to resolve this issue by delivering a software update over the air. It took about 45 minutes. Drivers could decide when they wanted that update to occur. This saved a tremendous amount of headaches for drivers. It also saved them a trip to, the dealership or wherever they were going to get their car repaired. It saved Tesla a tremendous amount of labor costs, and is a great example of identifying an issue before customers really realize that they have a problem and providing a solution to that issue. The final use case that we see on consumer side is innovation. And this to me is one of the most interesting and maybe transformative. This is about leveraging feedback from data, from sensors and other data sets, for much more rapid research and development. I like to think of this as one of the best ways to circumvent or perhaps expedite or accelerate existing rather slow market research modes, such as survey groups, focus groups, things like that. This can happen through solicited or unsolicited feedback, as well as direct customization. If you have a smartphone, you might be accustomed to occasionally receiving an update. Nothing changes about the hardware, it's your same phone, but some of the experiential elements change. Some of the ways that you navigate things change, the aesthetics change. This is a simple example of that that's already happening today. Another example, I have to call out Tesla again because I love this example. One of the interesting things that they do is they allow their drivers the ability to submit feature requests. So if I'm a driver, I can request a feature that I want. They recently had a driver submit a request. This driver was based in Los Angeles, a very traffic-heavy area, and this driver requested the feature for a crawl feature. In other words, very, very slow cruise control or autonomous drive at, I think it was between 6 to 8 kilometers per hour, slow. Well, Tesla doesn't take all of these feature requests, but they did implement this one. And so they customized a specific feature to this specific driver. But this is where it gets even more interesting. Not only did they implement this feature to this specific driver, but they rolled this feature out to their entire product fleet. So think for a second about what this could mean from a research and development, from an innovation standpoint, when you effectively are crowdsourcing your R&D, your innovation process. Who should design the product? The customers who we expect to adopt the product, right? So what I hope I have illustrated is at least the potential for this mutual value exchange between brand and consumer. And what's interesting is that these values can look very similar. On both sides, we see increased efficiency, increased convenience, increased visibility into the customer, into convenience, or into ways to better make decisions, increased information and intelligence. And so the more consumers are inspired to do within the context of their interactions, the more that brands and consumers can really deliver this mutual value. But what kind of makes this symbiosis or this feedback loop go around? It's actually solving problems. It's actually creating value. It's actually doing something meaningful. This is really important. There are many who say that the internet was the age of information, and I think that's very correct. And I like to think of the Internet of Things as the age of enablement, the age of actually doing something, making a change, conserving, allocating, accomplishing. And so I want to leave you today with a few takeaways unique to consumer-side IoT, particularly this first one. We can't talk about consumer IoT without talking about and addressing the use and the abuse of consumer data. As I was looking at the German market for this talk, what I found, is that in this realm anyway, it looks very similar to the American market, which is that most German consumers have never heard of the Internet of Things, 88%. The number is 87% in the United States. That's not because they're stupid, that's because the internet, well, one, it's because the Internet of Things as a term doesn't really mean anything. What does IoT even mean? Two, there's very little education occurring at any level around what this actually means and what the implications are from an everyday standpoint, from the use, protection, security, privacy of our data. The chart on the right, your right, shows all of the reasons that German consumers have not particularly adopted smart home devices. Well, you can see many of these reasons have to do with, well, not really understanding the value, relative concern around the use of their data. And so this creates a huge gap. On the one side, we have a big question mark on the consumer side. But on the other side, we in the tech industry, businesses, corporations, industry are moving at lightning speed towards this Internet of Things vision. Tremendous amount of investment is going into this. So there's this increasing gap between the momentum on the business side and sort of the stagnation or lack of understanding on the consumer side. So lesson one is to develop consumer trust through ethical engagement and also through education. And what we find in our research is that there are really 4 pillars to this. We advise companies to communicate to their consumers about the use of their data by educating them, by providing resources, accessible language, not written in legalese, as we call it, tools, community, rating systems, transparency and disclosure, particularly around the anticipated use of data. If, as a company, you find yourself in a position of a data breach or malpractice, maluse of the data, you will fare far better in court having articulated the intended use cases for your data. It's also helpful for customers to know how you're planning to use their data. Third, user control and the ability to intervene, agency in how our data is used. Certainly in the United States, there is this binary all or nothing. You're either entirely in or you can't use the service. How about some gradients of options? How about some menus? How about some ability to control what data is being used? Interestingly, in the research, we also found that value creation and the alleged value that you will get out of using this connected object is also sort of poorly articulated by brands. What's the point? Going back to that graph I just showed, why would I want to use this in the first place? What are the expected safeguards? What are the expected values I can achieve out of this? Not being well communicated today, and definitely one that's critical. And sort of given the nature of IoT, of connected devices and platforms, use the digital feedback mechanisms inherent to consumers reading this information, interacting with this information on screens, on digital platforms, to optimize this process. Lesson 2, embrace these use cases that we've talked about holistically and across the entire customer journey, the entire customer experience. What we found in the research, unsurprisingly, is that when it comes to reward and information decision making, these are very useful tools for awareness building, for developing brand affinity, brand awareness, for helping consumers make decisions, interact with the brands before purchase. Facilitation is fundamentally about that transaction. It's also about the action and the interaction of the product during purchase and post-purchase. When it comes to service and innovation, this is about building brand loyalty. This is about good, clean, streamlined customer support experiences. Again, think about these use cases and how to leverage these use cases across the entire journey. One great example of this is, you all might have heard of Disney's Magic Band, which is a wearable that they use in their theme parks. And they're really combining a lot of these use cases. This shows sort of the trajectory across the customer journey. Again, kind of pre-purchase, what are some rewards that they can incentivize you to purchase, but it's really most interesting once you actually get into the park, the theme park. All of the list of items on the right there are all of the different ways that this wearable becomes your digital identity, your check-in, your resort key, your pass to get on rides. Integrated with the mobile app, this tells you relative to where you are in the park, the most efficient routes to navigate, the lines that are shortest if you're waiting to find a roller coaster. If you go and play games, you create an avatar that's actually stored over time. If you leave the park and come back a year later, that same data is unique to you. It serves up, restaurant suggestions, event suggestions, activity suggestions. It really becomes a way to more deeply experience the theme park. A good example of really using this across the entire journey. And so what all of this requires from a technology backend is a lot of integration. It's a lot of interoperability to make this seamless, this potential for a better experience and for mutual value creation come to be. We call this at Harbor Smart Systems. What we've talked about today is just one use case and its sub-use cases on the consumer experience side. But ultimately, these items have to come together. As Disney is using this data, for example, to optimize the layout of their park, to optimize where their employees are, being staffed on one particular roller coaster versus another particular restaurant, for example, all of these have to come together. These are our 8 primary use cases that each have somewhere between, I think, 3 and 8 sub-use cases across any IoT application for any business. Smart systems, as we call it, are about real-time user experiences and interactions, and they're informed and supported by complex network and information interactions. So the third lesson here is to leverage your product and service ecosystem. We might have heard a little bit about this already, but this is a key point. One of the examples I want to use here is around this digital farm to table. And the idea here to think about is looking across your value chain to understand ways to develop new business models, to develop new services, and to develop new ways to bring value forth. So let's take, for example, a piece of steak, a packaged piece of meat. Think about what data collection across every level of the value chain of that one product means for the farmer, for the agricultural supplier, for the distribution network, for the packaging company, adding sensors to this, for the retailer, for tracking this inventory across the retail environment, for the end consumer who wants to know about, is it organic, where was it sourced, for potential brand partnerships, what sorts of recipes will I make, what sorts of spices could I use, all sorts of different things across every single phase, all the way to, waste management, landfill management. If we follow this piece of meat, as it were, across the entire cycle, suddenly we see, wow, there are lots of new ways, potentially, that any one of these entities could be working together across the value chain. And so, at Harbor, we call this smart systems design. And this is really an approach or a set of methods or processes to help companies identify these opportunities across the value chain. Whether a brand, or industrial client, an enterprise client, every single business has to leverage its ecosystem from a technology standpoint, looking at the behaviors, not just of its consumers, but of its partners, technology and otherwise, third parties, the relationships between all of these entities, all of the technology pieces that come together for this, the skills internal or which need to be brought in-house, all of the data and content that is delivered, and the focus of my next research, the role of the end user experience or interface in this process. IoT business strategies have to extend not only to customer experience, but integrate the processes and systems that are behind these experiences as well. And so I hope that I have conveyed some of the unique attributes of consumer-side IoT. I want to leave you with these three pieces. Value is the currency of IoT. Value, utility, strong systems, meaningful systems that create benefit in people's lives. Trust is the binding agent, particularly on the consumer side. Brands must consider the ethical and educational implications across the entire data lifecycle. Finally, ecosystems are the leverage here. Interoperability, cross-pollination, looking across the value chain, it's these partnerships that inform innovation and the framework for new business model development. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.